What's up, y'all? Welcome to this video. In this video, I'm going to be giving my thoughts and review of Song of the South, Disney's most infamous film ever. I'm doing this because this is the movie that Splash Mountain is actually based on. Most people don't know it's based on a movie. And for those who do not know, Splash Mountain is now getting a retheming, a reimagining, getting rid of all the elements from Song of the South and using the Princess and the Frog instead. This is done in light of the whole Black Lives Matter movement, people calling out Splash Mountain for using sort of a racist kind of movie, a very controversial movie. So that's why they're going with Princess and the Frog instead. And so yeah, this movie, Song of the South, it's been on my mind a whole lot recently. I had actually seen it before years ago in 2017. And like I said, I watched it again recently. In light of all the controversy, I wanted to come out and sort of give my sort of thoughts about the movie and the legacy of Splash Mountain itself, because I think that ride has a very interesting legacy in Disney lore. Now, like I said, there's a whole bunch of controversy surrounding this movie. The movie is so controversial and sort of its race themes that it's never been put out on any sort of media. It's never been on VHS, it's never been on DVD, it's never been on Blu-ray, and it hasn't been available on Disney Plus. CEO Bob Iger says, yeah, Song of the South, you can forget that. That ain't never gonna be on Disney Plus. So there's a whole bunch of controversy about this movie. It's Disney's probably most infamous movie when it comes to sort of the race elements, how it's remembered and sort of stuff like that. Now, for those who do not know, this movie was released in 1946, and it takes place during a very vague area of the 1800s. Some say it takes place during the the Civil War area during the Reconstruction. Others say it's before that. Regardless of what era it takes place in the 1800s, because it is very vague, the film is essentially slavery. Look at the whole setup of how it's got a plantation and a whole bunch of black folks sort of working there, being in some sort of subservient roles and stuff like that. It's essentially slavery, but it's Disney's version of slavery. So you can understand right off the bat, they're all like, oh shit, we got a movie in our library about slavery? I don't care how it's portrayed, we can't really have this out in the open like that. So that's reason number one why this movie is probably buried the way it is. In terms of what the movie's about, like I said, the movie takes place in a vague area during the 1800s, but essentially what you got is a plantation. You got this rich white family who has this young little boy who's going through some issues, being that his father's recently left on a trip, and he's having to deal with neighborhood bullies constantly. What ends up settling him down, though, is the stories about Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, and Brer Bear, told to him by Uncle Remus, who's essentially sort of the head of the slaves there. He's sort of an old black slave, and he's sort of a happy-go-lucky fella, and he's telling the stories to this little white boy to sort of calm him down, and those stories sort of help him out in his everyday life. Should be noted that these stories of Brer Rabbit and all of his friends take place in sort of the cartoon world. So the movie is essentially the same concept of sort of a Who Framed Roger Rabbit or Space Jam. These films are sort of a hybrid between the cartoons and the live action world. I'm going to start off immediately by just going out and addressing the controversy and issues about this film, which from my perspective is threefold. One, it's a Disney movie about slavery. A family-friendly brand like Disney, to have a film about slavery, and we're talking about now we're decades past the civil rights movement, that just ain't going to fly really in sort of any era, but especially from Disney, it's kind of like, what the hell were they thinking making a movie during this time period and almost sort of glorifying it to where it's all like, wow. Y'all really should have thought of a better way to sort of frame the story, or a different era to sort of frame that story. And Disney's had some racist stuff in the past too, when you look at Dumbo, the Fantasia, a certain segment and character. But a movie blatant about slavery from Disney, that just ain't gonna fly in any period really. The second issue that I see is the portrayal of Uncle Remus himself. He's portrayed as this sort of happy-go-lucky soul who's happy to serve under the white folk and really just not, almost unaware of sort of the real sort of horrific circumstances that he's in. And the way he's looked, I mean, his nose and his cheeks are so shiny, it's almost looked like he's in blackface or something. And it's almost as if like sort of the filmmakers are almost sort of making fun of this guy when you're watching it. It's just like, look at this dumb Negro right here. And it's just like, Jesus Christ. They could have portrayed him a certain way, but the way they did it here was almost sort of like the worst way possible, just in terms of his look, his attitude, and his voice is a very sort of stereotypical voice. Though it should be mentioned that the guy that actually played Uncle Remus did get an Oscar for this role, so it shows that Hollywood actually wasn't all that terrible when it comes to black folk, even during the 1940s, but still the portrayal here, not good at all in terms of representing African Americans in sort of a positive way. And then the real issue with this film that I see is the portrayal of the times itself, and to me this is the largest issue out of all of them. Like I said, it's very vague when this film takes place, but it's essentially slavery. When you look at sort of the setup of the black folks and the white folks, it taking place on sort of like a plantation, stuff like that. Now this is slavery, which is the most horrific time, one of the most horrific times in the history of all mankind, let alone the United States. Yet in this Disney version, slavery is portrayed like it's a happy-go-lucky time where the blacks and whites got along just fine. I mean, the blacks were still under the whites, but it's like, hey, we can all get along, stuff like that. And as long as you got songs about cartoon rabbits and stuff like that, it's all going to be okay. And the film is just horrific from that standpoint, sort of misrepresenting the times and making it seem like this was a time that was okay, almost sort of glorifying this period when it comes to relationships between white and black folks, like it was okay. And from that perspective, it's just like this was one of the most ignorant things I've ever seen. Like, keep in mind, this movie was released in the 40s, so obviously white folks aren't going to make a movie where they're sort of demonizing themselves. But the portrayal of this period is just absolutely horrific. And for me, that's where the biggest controversy is about this film. The slavery element is the number one when you look at the Disney film about slavery, but just the way they sort of almost glorify slavery, and the fact that it wasn't all that bad a time when this was one of the most horrific things in the history of all mankind. And the way it's portrayed here, yeah, don't exactly put this in your history books or use it on your history test, because you will flunk like a motherfucker. Now, getting those controversial elements out the way, the racial elements about this movie, I will say that there are some good elements to this movie that actually do make it sort of worth the watch and not sort of a torturous experience to go through. One, and this is sort of a guilty pleasure reason for me, is the hybrid element between the live action and the animation. I've always loved this concept when I see it in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Space Jam, even something like Looney Tunes Back in Action, where you do sort of live action and classic animation. To me, there's something always magical about that. And while this film doesn't have a ton of segments where those two elements meet, I do sort of love the way they do it on a technical perspective is cool, and some elements for a movie made in the 1940s, how they incorporate the live action and the animation together, is actually pretty impressive. The second element that's really good is the songs, man. That song Zippity Doo-Dah, there's a reason why you hear that all around Disneyland, and so many people don't even know where that song comes from, but it comes from this movie right here, which did win an Oscar for best song, and justifiably, just because it is a really good song. And regardless of how it's sung by sort of Uncle Remus in this movie, you can see why it's such a popular song, and why Disney's are like, well, we're not going to bury this song, so let's go ahead and keep it out in the open, just because it is a fun song. And the other songs that they got in this movie, How Do You Do and Laughing Place, those are good songs too, and those are songs that you do hear on Splash Mountain itself. And the second and the third thing that I will say is that the animated segments are actually fun. Now, the movie is mostly the live action segments, but the animated segments, when they are there, they're fun. The Adventures of Brer Fox and Brer Rabbit, they're sort of funny kind of cartoon characters. Now, there is some controversy about those characters because they're essentially sort of black characters, and sort of their voice, some people see it as sort of overly stereotypical. I don't really see it that way. I never get sort of offended or whatever if a cartoon character sounds black, unless you're doing something like those robots from Transformers 2. Most of the time when characters sound sort of ostensibly black, I don't have too much of a problem with that, and I don't think it was done too over the top in this movie. But like I said, those cartoon elements with those things, those characters, was actually fun. It was, like I said, the music, sort of the cartoon gags they got themselves in. Unfortunately, those segments don't make up a whole lot of the movie, or most of the movie, I should say. But when they are there, they are fun. Now, I will say, as sort of a final element, is that the story itself, in its weird, twisted way, did have some heart. If you can get past the fact of the misportrayal of sort of the times, the relationship the little kid does form with Uncle Remus, and especially the ending, where he really almost does look to him as sort of a father figure. Like I said, if you can get past sort of the weird historical inaccuracy of the time, the movie itself in its own world does actually sort of have some heart to the story. So in that perspective, I will say I do give it some respect there, especially for a movie in the 1940s to be portraying black people like this. I don't know, or in sort of that positive relationship between blacks and whites, because that certainly wasn't exactly going on during this time. But for Disney to do it, I will give them props in that perspective, even though it is totally historically inaccurate, almost offensively so. So those are sort of the main elements about this movie that's worth talking about. Is obviously the controversy, the animation, and sort of the good and the bad and stuff like that, and how the whole film sort of came together, and of course the songs. So I'm not going to give a rating for this movie just because it's too weird to almost rate when you got something that's so sort of like controversial. All I will say is that it's a movie that is worth watching. One, because Disney has tried to bury it, and I think anything that someone tries to bury is sort of worth watching to sort of see why they bury it, so you can sort of see the good and you can see the bad, and this movie definitely has plenty of both. And I've always tell people that you should go out and watch this movie just because I just find it to be such an interesting concept of the history behind this movie, the fact it was made by Disney, and sort of the legacy that it led going into Splash Mountain. Now, in terms of this movie's legacy as well as Splash Mountain's legacy, it's just so goddamn interesting to me. Just because Splash Mountain is a ride that did not open up in 1955 when Disney first opened. This is a ride that opened up in 1989. Now, this is way past the point when Disney realized, oh shit, this movie's kind of offensive. What the hell did we actually make here? Let's go ahead and try to bury this movie. But then they come out in 1989 with a huge ride based on elements from that movie, where you got only the cartoon elements that sort of carry over into the ride. When you're talking about Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, Brer, and the songs, the stories, all that kind of stuff. Now you can say to yourself, well, okay, they're just using sort of the cartoon elements, they're not including slavery or anything like that. But regardless of that, it's still based on that movie. And that movie is obviously something Disney has tried to bury, yet they come out with a huge ride, which makes people wonder. A whole bunch of people think that Splash Mountain is sort of its own original story or original ride, like sort of Big Thunder Mountain or Space Mountain and stuff like that. They come out and they realize, oh shit, it's based on a movie? What movie? Oh shit, what the hell is this? Song of the South? So in that perspective, it's really kind of fascinating that Disney, for a movie that they really try to bury, they would come out and say, well, I guess let's go ahead and try to make a ride based on it. Now, the ride itself is my favorite ride at Disneyland. I love this ride. I love the whole sort of water log ride experience. I think it's got great music from using those songs from that movie, Zippity Doo Dah, How Do You Do, The Laughing Place, that stuff. I think it's got a fun story, and it's got great thrills when you're talking about those drops, especially that last drop. If you've ever been on Splash Mountain, you know how incredible that final drop is. Regardless of that though, controversial elements still made for a great ride. But now, as I mentioned at the top of the video, in line of the Black Lives Matter movement, people tearing down statues and stuff like that, sort of erasing history, people take a look at Disneyland and say like, what the hell are you guys doing making a ride based on a controversial sort of racist movie that you guys yourselves have buried, and all sort of home media and making sure people don't know anything about this movie. So that's why so much attention got called to Splash Mountain, and why Disney finally, I guess they sort of caved in and said, you know what, let's go ahead and change it. And what they're changing it with is Princess and the Frog. And if you've seen this concept art, you know that this actually does look kind of cool. Now, nothing ever looks as good as the concept art, but if you're going to replace or retheme Splash Mountain, Princess and the Frog and the elements from that movie is really cool, and there is something symbolic when you sort of remove sort of what's viewed as a racist film towards African Americans, and you replace it with a film that features Disney's first black princess, and a movie that is actually pretty damn good in itself, and relatively recent. I know it's been a decade since that movie released, but it is still feel kind of recent in some regard. So in that perspective, I can sort of understand why they're going through with it, because of the peer pressure, the sort of way to sort of lighten up a new ride, remove sort of a racist sort of thing from the park's history. And like I said, it should be sort of really interesting and sort of get people's attention, though it does sort of draw a whole bunch of more attention on Song of the South. But now that movie's legacy, once the whole retheming of Splash Mountain actually happens, that movie's legacy will essentially be gone, because all that movie had going for it was the fact that you did have Splash Mountain, and now that that ride's gone, this movie, maybe it will now finally be lost forever, now that it doesn't have any ride and it's not available on any sort of home media. But I do still think you should see the movie just to see sort of the history behind it and its legacy it left on Splash Mountain. So that'll do it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and thank you for watching.